Welcome back to China Freedom File. Today I want to focus specifically on the difference between the Chinese officially recognized, registered, supposedly legally protected Three Self-Patriotic Movement Church and the independent house church, traditionally known. Because many friends from the free world, when you travel to China and when you sit down in a government-sanctioned Three Self-Patriotic Movement, or you call it TSPM church, you would find, well, I did not see any persecution there, and I would even see some big crowd, like some very big churches with huge church buildings in Beijing, in Shanghai, Nanjing, or Hangzhou. Some churches even can host as many as like 6,000 people, like a mega church kind of standard. And some American or European kind of church or para-church leaders, such as Franklin Graham or Louis Palau or others, when they visit China, they were even invited by the Chinese government and the TSPM leadership to even preach a sermon in a given Sunday, and apparently kind of unfiltered during their preaching. And some American politicians, such as the former President George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States, when he visited China, he told me he even purposely leave kind of a Sunday open and try to go to a government-sanctioned church to even worship together with other members. And so I was always asked, like, Bob, what's wrong with the TSPM, the Patriotic Movement Church? And after all, they're able to use the same Bible as we do, and they are also able to sing hymns, and they are able to worship with a pastor there. Is much like a Western church. And why does the house church refuse to join the TSPM church? And the Chinese government propaganda also said, well, if the advantage to join the TSPM is you are going to be legal, and you are registered legally, you're protected by the government, and so why do you want to risk yourself by worshiping without registration, and risk yourself being declared as illegal? So I today want to kind of, as a part of the explanation, I want to use this segment to First, give us a background of from a historical perspective, this. What is this three-self patriotic movement? What's the true nature of the three-self, and how the Chinese government is managing this three-self patriotic movement organization and its affiliate organization called Chinese Christian Council, and the churches that they claim under its leadership. So first of all, when I was asked about what's the fundamental difference between TSPM churches versus the house churches, I always start with this kind of a disclaimer, as we always need to remember it's very different between the three-self patriotic movement association and the thousands of churches that under its acclaimed leadership. So there's a fundamental difference between this organization called TSPM and those churches. And so when we mention and talk about this TSPM, I refer first and fundamentally to the nature of this organization. And certainly, this organization, they claim they're representing these many thousands of churches. And let's start from explaining what is this TSPM. I mean, literally speaking, three-self patriotic movement. This TSPM means the self-government or self-governance, and self-propagating, and self-management. It's like the 自传, 自立, 自养. So when you talk about self-governance, that means they always claim, well, we are not part of any denomination. So the three-self TSPM, this organization, always claim the Chinese church is entering or has entered into a so-called post-denominational epoch, since the Chinese Communist Party took power. So they claim there's no foreign denomination, no Baptist, no Presbyterian, no Assembly of God, and no Evangelical Free Church. This denomination label at all. So there's so that's called they call it self-governance. And then you have the self kind of management. Means really the kind of preaching. The financial management. They are already not depending on a support by any foreign entity or other external entities. So they said we are financially self-supporting, and we don't receive any aid from any foreign governments. And then the third self means self-propagation, or basically they said, okay, we are having our own theology. We are an independent church. We are not kind of adopting the missionaries' kind of theology. We are already having a kind of the Christianity rooted inside the China context. So from the surface, to have the self-governance, self-supporting, and self-propagating, looks fine. After all, since 1807, when the first Protestant missionary Robert Morrison entered into China, and for decades and decades, the Chinese church, or maybe for a century, has to really rely on the kind of support and rely on the theological teaching, rely on the experience of church governance from these Western missionaries. And it took the missionary Robert Morrison 7 years preaching and sharing the gospel, and the first convert of Chinese came his name is Liang Fa, and it took another 7 years, 14 years later, a fellow Chinese pastor was baptized. Was ordained. I shouldn't say baptized. Was ordained. You can call it the first indigenous Chinese preacher was ordained. So the Chinese church since 1807, the Protestant church, is a relatively a new church, and to the point that because there are so many Chinese were so hungry for the good news, for the gospel. So the missionaries have to hire even some non-believers because of the desperation. basically to give them a salary so that these non-believers have to distribute the gospel tracts, and they called the church employee or church workers, even though some even themselves do not even believe. They still as a part of employed work, they went out and distribute the Bible and the gospel literatures. And certainly, even the first copy of the Bible in Chinese language was translated into Chinese by foreign missionaries. And the most commonly used Bible, called the Union version of the Bible, 和合本, was translated all by the foreign missionaries. So really in 1912 or 1911, that was the first draft, the first copy of the Mandarin Chinese Bible was published. So we're still using that version today. Of course, there are many other now translations of Chinese Bibles. So in the mid 1800, like 1850s, there are some missionaries felt, well, in order to have a healthy Chinese church, we shouldn't make the Chinese church too dependent upon the foreign missionaries. And after all, the Chinese church and Chinese missionaries, Chinese pastors, Chinese believers need to grow up and need to plant their own church in their own field. And the so-called indigenous movement, kind of the concept, was planted from there. So that was the initial beginning of the three self principle: self-governance, self-supporting, self-propagation, or propagating. And by 1877, there is a almost unanimous consensus inside China, within the mission societies, with foreign missionaries. Basically, they said this three self kind of principle should be promoted and applied as much as possible inside China and to the Chinese church. That's why, then later, 1800, the Chinese mission movement started from many parts of China. They called the indigenous or indigenized church movement. And so many Chinese Christians like Wang Mingdao, like Watchman Nee, like the spiritual movement later on became the Back to Jerusalem movement. They're all actually initiated and led by the Chinese Christians and Chinese church leaders. So it was the kind of a perception and the concept of three self: the self-governing, the self-propagating, the self-supporting, are very much were a healthy kind of moment, and until 1950, 1 year after the Chinese Communist Party took power in mainland China. And the Chinese Communist Party's then premier Zhou Enlai, he reportedly had 3 days a nice kind of meeting with one of the liberal theologian, a Chinese guy called T.Y. Wu, Wu Yaozong, T.Y. Wu. So he later on became one of the founders of the modern TSPM movement, the Three Self Patriotic Movement. So after 3 days of intensive talking, and now unveiled by some of the historical records, including Mr. Wu's diaries, revealed the Chinese Communist Party basically tried to cultivate him, to persuade him to make a political campaign, basically to proclaim, to use him to rally the Chinese church to behind the Chinese Communist Party's rule. So 1951, there is a declaration of basically a three self kind of independence, so-called church movement. And then by 1953, there was the Korean War started. So the TSPM kind of formatted a so-called preparatory exploitation committee of it's called Three Self Assisting Korea and Against America movement. Three Self Assisting Korea and Against America movement. 三自抗美援朝，三自爱国运动委员会。So from the very start, this organization, TSPM, was instigated or even pressured by the Chinese Communist Party top leadership and using figures, public figures in the church like T.Y. Wu and Bishop Ding later on, and others who received some Western liberalism theological education, and from like Union Theological Seminary, etc., and to utilize Christianity to support the Communist Party's ruling. And then, of course, the Korean War. That was a rallying cry. Basically, the Communist Party tried to use the Christians and Christian believers to back them up. And in 1954, this organization was officially established. So this TSPM, and later on in 1980, another parallel organization called the CCC, the Chinese Christian Council, with a special focus on the so-called theological education and Chinese theological foundation kind of building. It's almost like in charge of China's seminaries. It's like this TSPM and the CCC. The kind of the main leaders are the same leaders in the same leadership, and they just see in different offices, working with different emphases. So this TSPM and CCC as two organizations, when from both history and the reality even today, these two organizations are nothing but Chinese Communist Party's puppies, nothing but Chinese Communist Party's tool that are used as a political machine to manipulate and brainwash the Chinese Christians, to indoctrinate with a very deliberate purpose, actually, and ironically, by the beginning of a cultural revolution in 1966. The Chinese Communist Party's leaders, including like Li Weihan and those who are in charge of the United Front Working Department of the Chinese Communist Party, they're not hiding their goal. So they basically said the main goal is to erase and delete and destroy Christianity, destroy all religion, as the purpose of these organizations, and they want to basically telling and ordering these church leaders to destroy the church. So that's why many of these leaders, some were fake Christians, fake pastors, and some were, later on, were discovered when the Red Guards kind of during the 10 years Cultural Revolution, there is several of their TSPM leaders, including Bishop Ding, including there's a guy called Li Chuwen, who was the vice chair of TSPM organization. And in their homes, the Red Guards found the Chinese Communist Party membership card. So they are really the wolf with the lamb's kind of skin, and hidden inside the church, try to destroy the church. And most ironical figure was this Li Chuwen. Mr. Li Chuwen was actually a close partner of Chairman Mao Zedong during the Long March. He was the one. I mean, later on, of course, in the historical archive, was shown harbor 2 children of Chairman Mao during the Long March. And his public identity as a pastor, but he was an underground, Communist Party leader. And then, no wonder we have seen, now every time when the Chinese Communist Party launched this crackdown against the house churches, the independent house churches, the Three Self organization, always there. This organization not only kind of not a builder of the church, they're the destroyer of the church. They're the ones collaborate with the government, the top security office, the public security, United Front Working Department, try to destroy the church. So we can tell, this is just from a historical perspective. So the next time I will explain from a spiritual perspective, and certainly from an ideological perspective, and the fundamental difference. But we need to remember, brothers and sisters and friends, the book of Ephesians, chapter 5, verse 23. We are told who is the head of the church. Christ, Jesus Christ. So God, Christ is the head, the only head of the church, not the TSPM, not the Communist Party, not the Chinese government, not any human institution can claim they are the head of a church. Christ is the church, is the head of the church. Thank you for paying attention, and we'll see you next time. God bless you all.
Order your copy of this program from the GLC bookstore by calling the numbers or visiting the website on your screen. Please include the program number when ordering.